Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you were in control, and then something happened that made you really? Before proceeding, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you. Confused pilots spend a lot of time briefing and preparing for different scenarios. But what happens when something completely unexpected occurs at precisely the wrong moment and changes everything? Can preparation that and become the enemy? Stay tuned. The story of FlyDubai Flight 981 started in Dubai on the 18th of March 2016 at around 4 to 9 in the evening. A flight crew consisting of 2 pilots and 5 cabin crew met up in the FlyDubai crew room at Dubai Airport to start preparing for the night shift that they had ahead of. They were scheduled to operate 2 flights starting in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, flying up to Rosovonon in the Russian Federation, and then back again home to Dubai. The departure was scheduled for 21:45 Dubai time and would then land around 4 hours and 35 minutes later, meaning that the crew would not be back home again until later than 6 o'clock in the morning. In this video, by the way, all times will be referenced to Dubai time since this were where the crew was based. Now, even under normal circumstances, a flight like this through the window of circadian low would be quite challenging, but when the pilots started looking through their briefing material, they also realized that the weather in Rostov-on-Don was far from ideal. A cold front was scheduled to move down over the area during the night as part of a massive low pressure, and it was bringing with it strong and gusty westerly winds, as well as rain showers and possible thunderstorms. Now, Flydubai had provided their crews with special breathing when they had to fly into the Russian Federation. They did that since they would sometimes have to fly on meters instead of feet, and also because some Russian airports still gave their pressure settings in QFE, meaning in reference to the airport altitude rather than the Q, and which uses the sea level as reference on top of that. Rostov-on-Don was considered to be an extra complicated airport due to the frequent wind shears that could appear there on strong winds for forecasted, as well as a shallower than normal ILS glide slope of 2.4 degrees. Because of that, it was designated as a captain's-only airport, and that was a both landing and takeoff, and the pilots were discussing that as part of their preparation. Both pilots had been flying a lot during the previous 28 days, but they both had more than sufficient rest before the flight, and were feeling quite fit for the task. They had never flown together before. But this is not that uncommon in large airlines, when there are thousands of pilots working together. The captain was 38 years old and had a total flying experience of just under 6,000 hours. He had flown the majority of this time, 4,682 hours, on the Boeing 737 that they were now about to operate. But he had only just over 1,000 hours of command experience on it. He had previously been flying for Helios Airways, XL Airways, as well as Malaysian Airlines before joining FlyDubai in September of 2012. The first officer was 37 years old and had a similar experience as the captain, with a total time of just under 5,800 hours, but only 1,100 hours on the 737-800. His previous experience came from flying Cessna 421S ATR 42 and 72S, as well as a bit of Airbus A320. Anyway, the pilots were getting along fine and discussed the tricky weather at the destination, but both agreed that it was above planning minima, both for the destination and for the 2 alternates, Traban and Volgograd. On top of that, the company had decided that the difference in fuel price between Dubai and Rostov-on-Don was so high that it warranted the crew to uplift as much fuel as possible in Dubai. This is a practice known as tankering fuel, and when the price difference is high enough, it is actually worth it, even though that would increase their weight, and therefore burn more fuel on the first leg. With this tankering fuel, they would have much more fuel on board than they actually needed for the flight, giving them loads of time and options in case the weather at Rostov-on-Don would get worse. And interestingly enough, this extra fuel, which in almost all normal circumstances is a great thing to have, actually forms the first link in the chain that will lead up to what's about to happen. Now, one thing that the pilots did not have in their briefing pack was a significant MET report, or sigma, for the time of their arrival. But there was actually one issued. This report warned of severe turbulence from the ground up to 15,000 feet around the time they were supposed to arrive there. But anyway, the pilots briefed their cabin crew, And after that, they had to wait in the crew room for the aircraft, which was about 40 minutes late, returning from the incoming flight. Once it had finally arrived, the crew walked out to it and saw that it had already been hooked up to the fuel truck and the refueling had started. And as they were walking out to the aircraft, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for the first leg. Then, as they got closer to their destination, the captain would take over to do the landing, since that was a requirement according to the airport brief now. Before he started the walk around, the captain looked through the technical logbook, which was more or less completely clean. There was only some very small malfunctions noted. He left the logbook in the cockpit and then walked outside. As the first officer started setting the cockpit up for the departure, the cabin group quickly completed their pre-flight inspections and started board the 55 passengers who were scheduled for the flight, and once the captain got back into the cockpit, the low sheet had arrived showing a calculated takeoff weight of around 68 tons. The pilots completed their briefings and takeoff calculations, and at time 22:20, the aircraft started pushing back from its gate. The taxi out was completely standard. So at time 22:37, FlyDubai Flight 981 took off from Dubai and climbed up to their cruising level of flight, Lev 360, which is about 36,000 feet. The flight then proceeded completely normally towards northeast and towards their destination. Now, one peculiarity with the Boeing 777-800S at FlyDubai, which is different from the 800S that I normally fly, is that these ones were all fitted with head-up displays, or HUDs, on the captain side. These are prisms that are folded down into the field of view of the pilot, and on that prism all of the relevant information from the primary flight display is then projected. This means that the captain will be able to see all that he needs while still seeing the outside conditions as well, which is a great help, especially in low visibility, since there won't be any need to transfer the gaze from the cockpit instruments inside to the outside. Now, this might come to play a part in what's about to happen, and I will explain all of that after this. While I was working on the script for this video, I came across several news articles about this story who were gore restricted to the Middle East, meaning that I just couldn't access them. But that's when I fired up today's sponsor, NordVPN, who could change my virtual location to almost anywhere in the world at a click of a button with their help. I could unlock a lot more information for my research, which is how I normally use NordVPN, but you can also use them to access your favorite shows when you're out traveling, use Wi-Fi hotspots in a safe way, or just browse the web anonymously and super fast lately. Nord have also built in powerful cybersecurity tools to help you block intrusive ads, check for web trackers, and even scan files for malware before you download them, meaning that they're now so much more than just a normal VPN. If you want to try this out for yourself, then use the link in the description below, which is nordvpn.com pilot. This will give you 4 free months when you sign up for a 2-year deal, and you don't really risk anything since Nord always have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord. Now, back to the video. As far as we can tell, the cruise part of this flight continued without any really incident. We don't know what was said in the cockpit because the cockpit voice recorder only saved the last 2 hours of audio. But we do know that the captain's HUD was for some reason folded up for about 20 minutes in the middle of the flight and then folded back out again. Now, the HUD was supposed to be in use all the time during flights, so it's hard to know why the captain did this, but maybe he just wanted to enjoy the view of the night sky uninterrupted. Who knows? In any case, it is likely that the captain completed his approach briefing well before they reached the top of descent, because 1 hour before the descent started, they write out the pilot's width was disengaged and replaced with the left one, which is a normal sign that the pilots are switching control, since the outer pilot should always be engaged on the pilot flying side at 0140 in the morning, as the aircraft passed a reporting point called LAPTO. The crew called up Rust of Control and relayed their flight level to them. At that point, they also asked the controller if he had any updated weather information from Rost of Onan. And a few minutes later, the controller came back with the following information uniform from UTC time 2130, wind 25°9 m/second, gusting up to 15. Now, if you want to know that in knots, it's a little bit less than double. so 17 knots to 29 knots, visibility is 5 kilometers in light, showers of rain-scattered clouds at 390 m, broken clouds at 900 m, and overcast at 3000 m temperature, 6 degrees C, 2.3, and runway 22 in use. Braking action good. He also added that there was a temporary wind of 250 degree 13 m/second gusting 18 and a visibility of 1000 m in showers of rain and mist. Now this was not great weather, but pretty much in line with what the crew was expecting. The wind was quite strong, but only 30 degrees off the runway axis, meaning that the crosswind was not going to be that bad at all. So all in all, it looked like it was going to be a challenging but landable approach. The aircraft was soon handed over to the next controller, who informed them that there was also a segment in force indicating that severe turbulence was to be expected from the surface up to 15,000 feet. And this was the first time that the pilots had ever heard about that. The crew asked the controller to confirm which area was most affected, and he responded that almost the whole area was included in the forecast, but that no other traffic had reported any turbulence so far. Turbulence can often be forecasted like this when there's big pressure changes over a short time span in a region. But it's not always correct. At time 0217, the crew requested descent, and the controller cleared them to initially descend to flight level 190. They did that, and when they started getting closer to the level, the first officer asked for further descent, which prompted them to be handed over to the rows of approach controller. When they checked in there, they were told that there had also been reports of moderate wind shear from rows of Von Airport. It's very likely that the crew, when they heard this, briefed thoroughly how to fly the wind shear escape maneuver. But of course we cannot be sure, since the cockpit voice recorder from this phase of flight was still overwritten anyway. Those of you who have been following this channel for a while, you know what a wind shear is. But if this is the first time that you're here, well then subscribe and I'll explain it to you. Go on a wind shear is basically an abrupt shift in wind, either in intensity or direction, that typically happens either on final approach or right off departure, when the aircraft is most vulnerable to speed changes. Since the aircraft flies based on the surrounding air, a sudden change in wind can cause a very sudden change in lift, leading to the aircraft either climbing or descending very rapidly, which can obviously be really dangerous close to the ground now. Because of that, there are several warning systems on board who are made to try and detect these wind shears and let us pilots know about them as soon as possible. The first one of those systems is called the Predictive Wind Shy Warning System, and it will use the aircraft weather radar and any moisture that it can detect to try and see the wind shear, and then give us an early warning on the approach. If that system is activated, it will issue a go-around wind shear ahead, and to that we pilots can choose to either execute a wind shear escape maneuver or a normal go-around, depending on what we see fit. The second warning system is the Reactive Windshield Warning, which is coupled to the aircraft's Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, or EGPWs. It sounds like this: windy. And if that warning is issued, the aircraft is inside of a wind shear, and an escape maneuver must be flown. There are also a few other flight parameters that could indicate the wind shear even if no warnings are issued, and those are a sudden change of 15 knots indicated airspeed. Remember that: 1. A 500 feet per minute change of vertical speed. 5-degree change of pitch attitude. 1 dot. Sudden displacement on the glide slope, and finally, any unusual thrust level position for an extended period of time. These warnings and indications will become crucially important for this story, but it is also super important to understand what the pilots must do in case they find themselves in the wind shear. The danger is always that the wind shear could cause the aircraft to be pushed down into the ground, or lose so much lift that it stalls and starts falling down, and therefore these threats must be mitigated. So the wind shear escape maneuver includes the following items that must be done. The pilot flying must immediately disconnect the autopilot, push either toga switch, and then aggressively apply maximum thrust and disconnect the auto throttle, then simultaneously roll to wings level and pitch up to 15 degrees initially. After that, the speed brake must be lowered, and then the P flying must follow the flight director guidance, which will be in a special wind shear. Escape logic: after the toga buttons have been pushed. The pallet monitoring must verify that maximum rust has been set, and then check that all of the other items have been correctly done before continuing to help the pilot flying by, calling out any speed or altitude tendencies, as well as when the wind shear warning is actually out. You might have noticed here that this maneuver doesn't include any changes in flap or gear configuration, and that's because that might aggravate the situation, and the extended gear could actually help absorb any shocks if the aircraft would be forced into the ground. It also doesn't include any ATC calls. Obviously, during a normal go-around, both the gear and the flaps will be retracted, and the thrust will normally be set to a much lower value, and understanding the difference between these two maneuvers go-around and the winch escape maneuver will greatly help you understand what's about to happen. So like I said, it's very likely that the crew discussed this wind shear escape maneuver in detail, since the controller now had warned them about it, and also because it had already been mentioned as a possible threat in the airport brief. The crew were now cleared to continue the descent to flight level 60, and after that they were handed over to the Rostov radar officer, who told them to descend to 600 m on QF 990 hectopascals. The first officer incorrectly read back that clearance and said that they were clear to descend to 800 m instead. But this was not noticed by the controller, whose English was very poor. Here we can start to see the difference between flying in Russia and in most of the rest of the world. If this QF pressure setting that the crew just had been given would be selected on the aircraft's altimeters, well, then they would start to show the height over the airport. But the FlyDubai crews and their aircraft were not equipped to fly their procedures based on QF, but instead on Q, and which would give them the altitude over sea level instead. Furthermore, the aircraft can only select feet in the mode control panel, so the crew was trained to use conversion tables to convert meters to feet in order to follow the clearances that they were given in Russia. In this case, the crew asked to get the Q and value as well, which was given as 1,000 hectopascals since the airport altitude was about 280 feet over the sea. But the crew missed to actually set this setting and instead selected the QF of 990 hectopascals by mistake. This error meant that for the entire rest of the descent and approach, the aircraft was actually flying about 280 feet higher than intended. This, and the incorrect readback, will not have any impact on the outcome of this flight, but it clearly shows how easy mistakes can be made when there's a mix of different units and procedures involved anyway. The aircraft continued to descend and was eventually cleared for the ILS approach into runway 22 and also to contact Rostov Tower. The captain asked for flaps 1 followed by flaps 5 and at time 0238. The first officer called the tower controller up and reported that they would descending to 2,600 feet or 800 m and that they were about to capture the localizer. The tower controller welcomed them to the frequency and told them that the current wind was 24 degrees at 11 m per s, casting 15, and then cleared them to land runway 22. The crew read this back, and soon the localizer was captured, and then the glide slope. Everything looked completely normal at this point. Once they were fully established, they missed approach altitude of 2,300 feet was set, and then the aircraft started descending down towards the runway flaps. 10 was then selected, but almost immediately after that, the aircraft entered into an area of moderate turbulence. Initially, the captain kept the out-of-pet and out-of-throttle engaged, and then proceeded by asking the first officer to select gear down flaps 15 as well as flaps 25, and then finally flaps 30, which was their planned landing flaps. This meant that as the aircraft descended through about 2,000 feet, it was fully stabilized in the landing configuration. The flap 30 approach reference speed was 140 knots, and on top of that, they would also need to add a correction of minimum 5 and maximum 20 knots to account for the headwind. The way this additive is calculated is by adding half of the steady headwind component plus the full gust value on top. In this case, the steady headwind component was about 20 knots, meaning 10 to add plus the GS was 8 knots higher than that, so the wind correction should have been 18 knots. But the crew only selected 10. It's hard to know why they did this, but it could have been to increase the margin between the speed they were going to fly of 150 knots in this case and the maximum speed for flaps 30, which was 175 knots anyway. The aircraft continued to descend, and as they passed 1,850 feet, The captain decided to disconnect the Autopan AO throttle after first having called it out to the first officer. Now the automatics had been flying the approach well up until this point, but it's pretty common for pilots to disconnect early during gusty and turbulent conditions, just to get a better feel for how the aircraft behaves in order to prepare for landing. In this case, the captain was also using his head-up display, and with the help of that he was able to track the ISS very closely. The HUD gives flight director guidance through the help of a guidance cue, which is basically a round dot that the pilot can put the aircraft symbol over, and if that's done right, any approach or maneuver can be flown extremely accurately at time 0241 and 50 seconds. The captain called out that he now had the runway in sight. The aircraft was then at a distance of 7 kilometers away from the runway, at an altitude of 1,240 feet, and except for the turbulence, the captain had no issues with controlling the aircraft and continuing the approach. But 12 seconds after they had broken through the clouds, the go window ahead warning was suddenly triggered, and within a second, the first officer called out wind shear, to which the captain answered, "Wind shear, go around now." The fact that they reacted so quickly to this warning was a clear sign that they were prepared for the possibility of this happening. Like I mentioned earlier, in this case, the crew had the possibility of choosing to either fly a normal Goran or a wind shear escape maneuver, and they clearly chose the latter. The captain now pushed the thrust levers forward into the firewall, which is the mechanical stop, and that caused the engines to roar up to 102% N1. As he simultaneously pushed the toga switches, the head-up display now switched over to show the wind shear escape guidance, which included a dashed toga pitch target line, as well as a filled green wind shear target cue. The captain started pitching for those. But because of the huge thrust now being created by the undermounted engines, he also had to push significantly forward on his yoke to keep the aircraft attitude from rising above the guidance. This, how much momentum the engines create when at full thrust, is worth remembering for what will happen later now. To put this into context, during a normal go-around when the toga buttons are pushed, the outer throttle will drive the thrust to reduced Goran thrust, which is normally around 90%, N1. This amount of reduced thrust is calculated to give the aircraft a rate of climb of between 1,000 to 2,000 feet per minute, which would result in a nice soft go-around if full gown thrust would be needed. After that, the pilots could either push the toga buttons a second time or place the thrust levels fully forward manually like these pilots were now doing. That would naturally lead to a much steeper go-around and much more pitch momentum being created by the engines. But since this was a wind shear escape maneuver, the gear was not being retracted, and the flaps was still at landing flaps, meaning that the full thrust would not create a super high climb rate. So in this scenario where the captain started the escape maneuver only about 1,300 feet below the go-around altitude, the aircraft would have been climbing with a vertical speed he was pretty used to seeing. But the thrust level movements required in order to control the aircraft would have been much larger than in normal circumstances, and that will come with a requirement to trim. Since no configuration changes were to be made during the escape maneuver, the first officer concentrated on checking that all items had been done correctly, and then he decided to call up Rostov Tower to let them know about the missed approach procedure. He did so almost immediately after the maneuver had started, and at the same time as the aircraft's flight direct logic went from a Goran maneuver into the altitude acquire mode to give guidance for the aircraft to start leveling off. This call to ATC was not a great idea, since we, pilots, always have to follow the guiding principle of aviate, navigate, and then communicate. And at that moment there was still a lot of aviate left to do, as the captain now started pitching down to level off. Following the head-up display guidance, he didn't reduce the thrust fast enough, likely because of that huge movement needed, and this meant that the speed started rising quickly. The first officer called out, "Check the speed," and the captain responded, "Speed checked." And at the same time he also realized that he was still pitching up way too much. This caused him to press his stabilizer trim switches forward to try and help reduce the pitch. He held these switches forward for around 4 seconds, which is actually quite a lot, especially since the reduction of thrust would soon mean a need for pitch-up trim. Instead, now here it's probably worth talking a little bit about the way that trim is supposed to be used in this type of aircraft. The electric trim can be activated in a few different ways, but in manual flight, it is done by pressing the two trim switches on the pilot's control Y in whatever direction that the trim is needed. This will cause the trim wheels in the cockpit to start moving and to change the angle of the horizontal stabilizer in the back of the aircraft to help reduce the need of elevator deflection and therefore reduce the amount of forward or back pressure the pilot needs to input. The idea is that you first use the yoke to set the attitude that you need and then trim the aircraft so that the yaw can be returned to a neutral position. This means that you should never fly with a trim, as there's always a slight delay to the effect of it. Additionally, if you keep the yaw, for example, pushed forward, the use of the trim will not reduce the amount of force needed to keep the yaw in that position. It will only increase the effect of the pitch input. And this is different than the way that the trim works in some smaller aircraft, where it is the position of the yoke that is actually being reset. The electrical trim also moves faster when the flaps are extended. All of these facts will soon become super important anyway. The use of the trim helped the captain to quickly reduce the pitch with around 4 degrees, and with that came an even faster acceleration. Remember, the aircraft was still flying with a gear down and flaps 30 at this point, so the acceleration meant that the maximum speed of 175 knots was now fast approaching at times 0-242 and 34 seconds. The aircraft shot through the gore on altitude slightly, and the speed also increased momentarily to 182 knots, which the first officer pointed out. This activated the flap load relief function, which automatically reduced the flaps from 30 to 25 degrees, to save the flaps from the overspeed, but this was likely not even noticed by the crew. Instead, the captain descended slightly back to 2,300 feet and started a rather lengthy discussion with the first officer about if they had actually busted the flap speed restriction or not. Remember, the gear and the flap were still extended here, and the winch alert was actually still showing. Even though the conditions were now much better, the two pilots agreed that they had likely busted the maximum speed, and the captain said that he would call for maintenance to check it out once they were back on the ground. This all shows a good and professional attitude from the captain, and even though it would likely have been a good idea to wait with that discussion until after the aircraft was cleaned up and the go-around was complete, I can kind of understand what they were worried about here anyway. The crew now got back into contact with the approach controller and requested further climb. Since they were still in quite heavy turbulence, it took them a few attempts to actually get the controller to understand what they wanted, likely because of the controller's poor English. But eventually they were clear to climb to 5,000 feet. The captain engaged the autopilot out. The throttle started accelerating and then asked for the gear and the flaps to be retracted. Now, this might have all seemed quite messy, but actually it wasn't that badly handled at all. The approach had been well flown. They reacted correctly to the warning, and even though they slightly overspread the flaps and overshot the gore on altitude, but a little bit, a winch or escape maneuver is tricky to fly, and it's very rarely flown outside of the simulator, so up until this point the flight had been handled relatively well. But it is likely that the captain was very frustrated by the fact that he'd been forced to do this maneuver, and that he wasn't able to land. That was shown when he later talked to one of the cabin crew members, where he mentioned several times that he had been forced to go around because of procedures, and that if it wasn't for that predictive warning, he would have likely been able to land just fine. This mindset of the captain, how sure he was that he would have been able to land, is important to keep in mind. The controller told the crew to continue toward watch a navigate called Bravo Alpha, since they were now number 2 in the approach behind an airlot aircraft that was about to start their approach. He also asked the crew what the reason for the go-around was, and they just answered winder. They also told the controller that they needed to maintain their present heading due to weather, and they asked for further climb to avoid the moderate icing, which they now find themselves in. This was approved, and they continued their climb to flight level 80. Once the weather avoidance was complete, the aircraft proceeded towards Bravo Alpha as cleared, and the pilots now started discussing whether or not they should try for another approach immediately or wait a while for the winch condition to hopefully move away. The captain indicated that he wanted to hear how the aircraft ahead of them would do before he made his mind up about this. And that's a very sensible thing to do. They had plenty of fuel, so there were no rush at this point. The controller soon came back and informed them that the aircraft had also gone around due to wind shear, and this just cemented the crew's opinion that it would be better to wait around a bit. They had around 9 tons of fuel still on board, which was enough to wait more than 2 hours before they would be required to divert. The captain proceeded to give a PA to the passengers where he explained the reason for their go-around and the fact that they would likely now have to hold for a while to wait for better weather. After that, the pilots tried to ask for a holding area to the north of the airport instead, due to the bad weather at their current position. And they also started moving in that direction, was constantly discussing the vectors with the controller, who was struggling back badly to understand what they wanted to do so badly, in fact that another controller had to step in and help at one point. At the same time, the aircraft was attempting a second approach, and about 10 minutes after they had left the approach frequency, they came back again reporting that they had been forced to make another go-around due to wind shear. This was just a further confirmation that the bad weather was still very much present over the airport. So Flight 981 just continued waiting, eventually climbing up to Flight 115 and establishing themselves in a holding pattern over the MiC November NB to the southwest of the AER drome. The aero flight had not given up yet, though, and at time C316 they went around for the third time, and after that they finally decided to divert to their alternate things. Definitely weren't looking very good at this point, so the pilots of FlyDubai 981 started taking weather information for their alternate Volgograd in case it would be needed. They still had plenty of fuel in the tanks, and from what they could see on their weather radar, the weather was actually getting a little bit better in Rondon, so the captain suggested that they should wait a bit more, then maybe shoot another approach. And then, if that was unsuccessful, they could divert after a while, and holding the captain left the cockpits to go to the toilet. And while he was gone, the first officer was joined in the cockpit by a junior cabin crew member. They were both Spanish, so they started discussing the situation, and from that conversation, you could clearly hear that the first officer was not very happy about staying and waiting in the holding. He was not as convinced as the captain about the improving weather, and he thought it would be a better idea to just divert to the alternate. Now, this was after 1.5 hours in the holding, so I can kind of understand where he was coming from. When the captain came back into the cockpits, they took more alternate weather this time for Manal, which looked even better. So they decided that this would be where they were going to divert in case they ultimately couldn't get in. The captain also got into contact with FlyDubai Operations Control via a satellite phone to let them know about the status, and they agreed with his assessment and also recommended them to hold in the hold as long as possible and then try another approach if they felt comfortable. So why was this so important? Why didn't they just give up and fly to the alternate well as a pilot? You always aim to perform your objective, which is to safely get your aircraft passengers and crew to the destination. A diversion would mean a lot of hassle for everyone. The passengers would have to be given alternate means of transportation. The crew would likely run out of hours, which would mean an overnight. And the outbound passengers would then have to either be severely delayed or maybe get their flight even canceled. All of this together with the fact that the captain had been visual with a runway on his previous approach and was pretty sure that he would have been able to land was likely behind his willingness to stay and wait. But in that way of thinking, there might have also now started to form a bias in the captain's mind, a kind of preset plan of how the next approach would turn out, and that could be important. We will get to this second approach very soon, but first, have you ever heard the phrase that someone is being behind the aircraft? Now, this is a term that explains the feeling of being behind what is going on and constantly having to react to things that you weren't expecting. This is a state of mind that is very common in the start of almost every career, where everything is new and sometimes can feel really overwhelming in an ideal situation. We pilots should always be slightly ahead of the aircraft and anticipate what will be happening next. This is why we prepare so much for each flight and brief so thoroughly before each approach and departure. If we are ahead of the aircraft, well, then we will have spare capacity to deal with anything unexpected, and we also have a much wider attention span. But if we fall behind the aircraft, almost all of our mental capacity will be spent trying to understand what is happening. And since we, because of that, won't be able to accurately deal with the situation, it might become worse and put us even further behind, ending up in a vicious cycle. Now, the way to deal with this is often to just stop whatever it is that you're doing, taking a deep breath, and then get back to following a trained routine, which is why we have so many procedures and checklists in aviation. After the aircraft had been holding for almost 2 hours, the crew finally started to get ready for their next approach. They had entered diversion routing into the FMC, prepared the charts, and they had also set the new approach reference speeds and recalculated their landing performance. The captain again very quickly briefed the approach and mentioned to the first officer that in case of a wind shower this time, they would do exactly what they did before, go around no flap or gear configuration changes anyway. At 20 minutes past 4 in the morning, the crew decided to go for their second approach. They asked for the latest weather from the controller, who gave him the wind of 230 degrees 14 m per s, gusting 18 visibility 6 kilometers with scattered clouds at 630 m, which is almost 2,100 feet, and no reported wind shear on the runway winch was still forecasted, but since there had been no reports during the preceding 30 minutes, the controller didn't report it. The crew requests the descent, and as they started getting vectors for the approach, they again discussed the speed additive, and this time they correctly identified it at the maximum 20 knots. Their reference speed was now 133 knots, since their weight had reduced to 54 tons after having burned off so much fuel in the hold, meaning that they would fly a final speed of 153 knots. These discussions and calculations were sharp and accurate, showing that there were no signs of fatigue present. At least not at this point. They were now directed to change over to the next controller, who cleared them to descend first to flight level 60 and then to 600 m on the Q and 9ER 8. When he heard this, the captain picked up that they had flown the last approach on the incorrect Q of 990 again, showing that he was on the ball here. He slowed the aircraft down and asked for flaps 1, and at this point both the AO pallet and autothrottle was still engaged. The conditions were very similar to the first approach, with moderate turbulence, and initially flown completely inside of clouds, with no outside visual references at all. Clubs 5 was now selected as the crew was given a report from a departing aircraft which had just experienced some light icing. But there were no indications that their aircraft was feeling any icing effects at all. The controller told them to turn to a heading of 270 degrees, and on that heading they were again cleared for the ILS from way 22 at time 0436 and 5 seconds. The aircraft intercepted the ILS localizer and started tracking it towards the runway. They were then at a distance of 11.5 nautical miles or 21.3 kilometers away, and at an altitude of 2,250 feet. The first officer asked for a wind check and was told that it was still 230 degrees at 12 m/second, costing 18, which was similar to what they were expecting. And they also received an updated Q and figure which they set on their altimeters, and they were then told to contact Rostov Tower. When they signed in, the tower welcomed them back, gave them the same wind as they had just received, and cleared them to land runway 22. Up until this point, everything was perfectly normal and in very, very similar fashion. As in the previous approach, they started descending down towards the runway following the guide slope, and as they did that, they also extended the gear select flaps 15, and then set the miss approach altitude to 8,000 feet. As they descended through 2,165 feet, the captain again disconnected the automatics, probably for very similar reasons. As the previous approach, he called for flaps 25 to be selected, and a few seconds later flaps 30. And then the first officer started challenging the landing checklist. When the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet, they were almost completely stabilized on path, and with the speed just slightly high at 163 knots, reducing toward 153. The captain called out stabilizing now as he tried to get the speed back towards the fly speed. But he was also about 0.3 knots high above the glide slope, so he had to push a bit forward. and this was also combined with a slight increase in thrust from 65 to 70%. That thrust was significantly higher than what would be considered normal for a 54-ton aircraft on final with flaps 30. Even on this slightly shallower approach, and that could have been a sign for what is about to come as the captain was doing these corrections. He likely also had the runway in sight given the visibility and height of the cloud cow, so it is reasonable to believe that he was quite landing-minded at this point. But now the poor weather again made itself known in the form of a strong positive gust of wind. This, in combination with a slight forward pitch and the high thrust, made the speed trend reverse directions, and instead of reducing using it now increased with 15 knots. In just a few seconds, this meant that the speed was now suddenly 1176 knots, 1 knot above the maximum for flaps 30. And if you remember, this type of sudden speed change actually qualifies as a wind shear indication. The first officer called out, "Check the speed," and when the captain looked down, he saw the rapid speed increase and decided to immediately go around. Now things will start happening very quickly. At time 0440 and 50 seconds, the toga switches were pressed and the thrust levers again moved fully forward into the mechanical stops. The captain only said, "Okay, go around," and never mentioned windar. But since he gave full trust, it's pretty fair to assume that this was the procedure that he was now planning to fly. But since there had been no warnings and wind shear had not been mentioned, the first officer likely thought that the captain was doing a normal go-around. So he asked if he wanted flaps 15. The captain responded, flaps 15. And here something started to happen. Most likely, the captain had been fully concentrated on the landing up until this point, and then, in his mind, he had switched over to the wind shear escape maneuver, but now he had started changing the configuration, which was part of another procedure that he hadn't mentally planned for, with the engines roaring at full thrust. Again pushing the nose upwards, he had lost the initiative, and he was now quickly starting to fall behind the aircraft. The first officer called out positive rate, which prompted the captain to ask for the gear to be retracted. So now this really light aircraft was climbing with full thrust and with significantly lower drag than it had during the last go-around. The captain also likely kept one hand on the thrust levers as he went around, which he shouldn't have. Once the go-around thrust is set, you should remove your hands and put both on the yoke, and in case he did so with only his left hand available to man a deal with a huge pitch-up momentum from the Indians, he now pushed forward even more than what was required, meaning that he never really reached the minimum 15-degree pitch-up that the head-up display was instructing him to do. It is also very possible that the flight director was now showing him a very high commanded pitch, much higher than normal due to the high thrust and the low drag, something that could have caused him to distrust the head-up display further, making the situation confusing for him. Meanwhile, the first officer was contacting the tower, informing them of the go-around again way too early given what was happening in the left and seat. The tower controller told him to contact the Rostov radar controller. But that call never happened. The captain was now pushing forward with a force of almost 23 kilos to keep the nose of the aircraft low, even though, like I mentioned before, the attitude should have actually been increased a bit further. Now trying to fly an aircraft that is so out of trim is quite complicated and increases the workload significantly, and that's on a pilot who was now likely really confused about which profile he was actually following, and if he could even trust his instruments. We know that he was mentally behind at this point, based on his recorded control wheel inputs, who were much longer and more abrupt than normal. With significant delays between them, he changed pitch several times, but he never really followed the head. Up display commands and the average pitch during the initial part of this go-round remained around 10 degrees far less than what was needed, and this meant that the aircraft was now starting to accelerate fast. Meanwhile, the first officer was not suffering from any mental blockages at this point, and he saw that the pitch was too low. He called for the captain to keep it to 15-degree nose up, and as a response to that, the captain momentarily actually pitched up to 18.5 D, but then almost immediately pitched forward again to 5 degree with a huge movement of the yawl. Now if you pitch to 18 degree and then immediately down to 5 degree again, it will come with some very real consequences in the aircraft, namely, you will create near weightlessness. This sudden reduction to 0.43 G was followed by a slight momentary reduction of thrust. And this is how we know that the captain still had his hand on the thrust levers, because this was not a voluntary movement, but likely instead a reaction to being lifted in his seat. The first officer kept calling out instructions to the captain on how to maintain his pitch. But as he did so, none of the pilots were monitoring the speed, which had now reached over 200 knots and was still increasing. This led to a flap blowback from 15 to 10 degrees in a very similar way to what had happened in the previous goon. But this time the situation was not getting better. At time 0441 and 30 seconds, that's 40 seconds into this go-around, the aircraft started entering into its final, really critical state. Now some of you might have noticed that I haven't mentioned somatographic illusion yet. And there's a reason for that. Somatographic illusion is what happens when the balance organs in our inner ears cannot distinguish between, for example, an acceleration and a pitch up. If we lack visual cues, the inner ear will assume that what we're feeling has all to do with pitch, and will therefore sum together any accelerations that, and pitch up, leading to a feeling of a much larger movement. A lot of people initially assumed that the reason the captain was pitching forward so much from the very beginning was because he was feeling the onset of somatographic illusion. But the investigators of this final report disagrees with that, because he was likely visile for the first few seconds of the go-around. It is unlikely that he would have felt the onset of this illusion at the very start. But as the aircraft now entered clouds and all visual outside cues were lost, it is very possible that the somatra illusion now kicked in and added to the already disoriented state of the captain. The aircraft was now flying through 3,350 feet with a pitch of around 10 degrees, nose up full thrust, and a speed of 210 knots. It's possible that the captain now started feeling tired in his left arm from all of the pushing, and therefore decided to start trimming forward, and he did so for the next 12 seconds, and that's without returning the yoke back towards its neutral position. Since the flaps were still extended, this allowed the trim to move at the highest possible rate, and together with this constant forward push, the pitch now moved forward with a speed of almost 6 degrees per second, tilting the aircraft violently towards the ground. This caused everyone on board to initially experience weightlessness and then negative GS, which would have pushed everyone up against their seatbelts and caused anything that wasn't properly tied down to be pushed up into the roof. This included the pilots, who were now likely feeling something that they had never been trained for now. It is possible that the captain was also lifted to an angle where it would have been hard for him to properly see the indications through the head-up display. But he also had the normal primary flight display, the PFD, available in front of him. The first officer now realized what was about to happen and desperately started calling for the captain, trying to get him back into the loop. He called pull up, but at that point the captain was likely so disoriented that he couldn't even hear him. He was now also pushing the rudders randomly in both directions, and doing that is something that has been identified as a sign of a pilot's complete disorientation. But the problem was that the captain was still inputting on the controls, and also calling out random words, meaning that the standard PILO incapacitation definition didn't really fit, and likely stopped the first officer from immediately taking the controls. Within seconds, the pitch of the aircraft reduced to -40 degrees with a speed of close to 280 knots. The first officer called out, "Be careful, no, don't do that, no, pull it," and for a short interval it seemed to actually work, as the pitch increased with around 11-degree tests have later showed that if the recovery would have continued from that point, with the engines reduced to idle and the aircraft continuing to pitch up, the accident could have been avoided. But instead the pitch down was now again resumed, and even though the first officer started pulling on his own controls, the captain continued pushing forward, which meant that it wasn't enough the ground proximity warning system called out terrain pull-up. But it was too late. This system had been certified based on a maximum vertical speed of 7,000 feet per minute. But the aircraft was now descending with a terrifying 18,000 feet per minute, and still with full thrust set. The captain, with the last show of his complete spatial disorientation, now gave almost full left air on, meaning that the aircraft started rolling rapidly. It finally crashed into the ground with a left bank of 60 degree, a negative pitch of 50 degree, and a speed of over 340 knots. This happened at times 0441 and 49 seconds, only 59 seconds after the go-around had started. All 62 passengers and crew were immediately killed in the crash, which left a big crater in the beginning of with 22 at Rosa Bondan Airport. The investigation found that the crash had been caused by the incorrect piloting and configuration of the aircraft, caused by spatial disorientation of the captain as part of a weather-induced go-around. This spatial confusion had likely been caused by a combination of the crew operating in the middle of the window of circadian low and an incorrect mental model of the captain, where he was prepared for either a landing or a windshire escape maneuver, not a normal go-around. When the escape maneuver transitioned to a go-around without this initiative, he fell behind the aircraft and was just unable to recover. This was then further made worse by the incorrect handling and understanding of the aircraft's trim system and unclear company procedures when it came to calling out either a go-round or a windshire escape maneuver. Somatogravic illusion could have played a part in the severity of the captain's disorientation, and lack of training in subtle incapacitation might have made it harder for the first officer to IFI that the captain was completely lost. There were 26 different detailed recommendations issued from this accident, several having to do with crew training regarding upset recovery, especially in situations with real G-forces, as well as improving pilots' general understanding of the aircraft trim system. This has since been incorporated in both initial and recurrent upset prevention and recovery training UPART for all pilots. The English level of the Russian controllers were also put under scrutiny, as well as the layout and use of head-up displays. And if you want to read all of the recommendations, I have created a document with all of them on my website, and you'll be able to find the link in the description below. Now, I hope my team and I have earned a subscription from you, and if we have remembered to select the bell as well so that you'll get a notification whenever I release a new video. Now you can support our work by joining my awesome Patreon crew. You can also buy a t-shirt or just commenting on this video, on maybe sending a super thanks. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.